this partial double octo final of Worlds. Let's have a round of applause for all the teams before we get started. So my name's James Clough. I'm joining the panel. With me is...
I'm Erin.
I'm Nick.
For the speakers, you can refer to the panel or me as the speaker, and that's fine. In opening government, we have Tel Aviv. In opening opposition, we have King's College London. In closing gov, TCD. Just before we get started, I kind of remind everyone, please try to not be so loud when speaking, especially don't do the thing where you cheer all the time through your own team speech, because then it makes it harder to hear. It's really counterproductive. So please try to avoid doing that and give all the speakers a fair chance to say what they want to say and do well in the round. I've checked that none of the judges are trainees. I think then we're all... I have absolutely no idea. Is anyone
Camera behind you, James. Yeah, I'm not comfortable with this debate.
Okay.
What? I'm not comfortable with this debate.
Yeah, if the speakers don't want to be filmed.
Sorry?
I
No.
imagine that's the same. Yeah. So please don't film speakers who don't want to be filmed. I guess that includes POIs if they can try to do that, or are you not?
Yeah, I'm less bothered about that. I just don't want to speak.
Okay. Are there any other speakers who would prefer not to be filmed? No? Okay, so please, that restriction also applies to people in the audience if they're filming or taking pictures as well. Does anyone speaking on the panel have any questions before we get started? No? Well, in that case, the motion was written on bits of paper. I'd like to get the exact wording. Does anyone have a little bit of paper with the motion on it that we could use? Sorry, Owen. Right. Oh, we've got one there. Right, so the motion that stands before the House then is that this House regrets mainstream commercial films that depict historical subjugation and or crimes against humanity. Are any of you guys good to do the timing? Right, so Roger will do the timing, bangs all as usual. There's no questions. Let's get started and invite the Prime Minister to present the case to Tel Aviv. Hear, hear.
Dear panel, this debate is about how we as society perceive terrible events that have happened in our history and the way in which we choose to learn from those events and the suffering that they have caused. We're talking specifically about issues where there has been historical subjugation, where there have been crimes against humanity. We're talking about films that depict, for example, the Holocaust, films that depict things like cultural subjugation, things, for example, Slumdog Millionaire would also constitute something that we're talking about in this debate, meaning showing the suffering of another culture and appropriating that culture in this way. We're talking only about those films that are made by mainstream culture, not films made by the group itself or by representatives of those groups that have been subjugated in order to show the suffering that have passed, but we're talking about things that are made by Hollywood and big film industries in order to show those specific things. Now, a very important thing to clarify here at the outset is that we believe that these events, to the societies that are involved in them, will be depicted and remembered anyway. They will be depicted by the fact that we have huge monuments to commemorate those specific events, like we have the Holocaust memorials in major European cities and in Israel and in other places that have been affected by this. We also say that schools usually teach those events and those crimes of the past. How do we know this? Because in cases where those events are not known, usually movies will simply not be made about them. Is this a clarification? No. So no. So I'm going to bring to three main things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to make a characterization of how these films are likely to portray those events and why that's harmful. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about appropriating the suffering and the voice of those groups that have been afflicted. Thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about why, even if we create more exposure, this is worse exposure and does not create an actually balanced historic picture of those events and does not lead to action on them. Yes.
Would you allow any Hollywood movies to be made depicting the developing world?
Depicting the developing world in general, yes. However, if we're talking about specific instances of cultural subjugation or crimes against humanity, then no. Let's talk about what. Let's talk about how these movies are likely to look. Because we say, firstly, there is a clear interest to depict a simple story that people can sympathize with. We say that the commercial interest is to sell that movie, to make a lot of people go watch it, to make it to some extent entertaining. Why is this critical? Because it means these movies are likely to have a happy ending of some sort, at least some message of hope within this context. Obviously, some of them end badly. However, they always end with some notion that this situation can be solved, that there is, and that this solution is likely to be simple, of the sort of generic Hollywood-type hero that goes and saves the day. The Americans coming in and liberating the camps in the movie Life is Beautiful by Roberto Benigni, for example, and the child receiving the tanks and so on and so forth. Secondly, we're saying that the likely portrayal of the group itself is likely to be adjusted to the mainstream in order to be able to sympathize with those characters. How do we know this? For example, in movies about the Holocaust, the great majority of Jews are secular Jews, although the great majority of people who have been massacred are people who are actually ultra-Orthodox and highly religious. These are people whose voice is simply being shut out. We don't know about them because it's much easier to sympathize with someone that looks like you, with someone who's a doctor, with someone who's secular, than with someone who comes from another group. Most Africans in movies depicting war crimes are people who speak perfect English and want a job in banking or being a doctor and things of this sort. Thirdly, we're saying that you are likely to want to depict heroes on both sides of the fence. You're likely to have at least some character on the offending side that is also someone you can sympathize with. Often the movie will actually be depicted also through their point of view. We're saying this is hugely harmful in appropriating the voice of that group and showing the other side is just as legitimate. We don't believe is actually the case in a lot of these instances. Now, why does this appropriate the voices of those groups? Because we're saying that when a group has been through suffering and has been through trauma, there is huge significance to having their stories told. How do we know this? Because they themselves try over and over to tell their story. Because we have Holocaust survivors who keep telling years and years after, refacing that trauma day after day and telling children about what they've been through. Because we have activists in the third world talking about the Khmer Rouge, for example, and the way in which they were mistreated. We're saying, therefore, that our obligation towards these communities, on the very basic level, is not taking away their voice in this manner. Why is their voice actually being taken? Because we're saying that, and comparing this specifically to these historical events being taught in schools and being taught to the people that actually matter in these places, because we're saying, firstly, that the messages in the mainstream movies are not likely to be made by the group itself, because they usually don't have the financial and economic power. Secondly, even in the best case on their side, when it does come from certain people in this group, it's not likely to be reflective of all of them. We're saying that in movies you have significantly less ability for dialogue. You have significant less ability to portray different stories, because you usually, on the issue of these events, have one or two major films that most people are likely to watch, and this is the narrative that's likely to be portrayed. So we're saying that you don't actually get the multiplicity of voices which you can get in the whole society being able to discuss what is taught in our history classes and so on. Note also that when we have both history classes and these movies, people are more likely to get the story through them. Children being educated are more likely to watch Schindler's List than to actually learn about what happened in the Holocaust. And we're saying that's critical because you're actually crowding, because this is more fun, because this is more thrilling and so on. Teachers are even likely to use those movies, and the educational system itself uses it. And therefore, we get more of a crowding out of the actual stories of these people. We're saying that is wrong to do. Moreover, we're saying it's wrong to benefit and make financial profit of their suffering in this specific instance. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
How much money do art house films generally have to promote their existence?
How much money do they have? Firstly, we're very happy. These specific instances, we say these instances, it does happen that groups, that the state funds this specifically because this is so important, just in the way that we fund it in the educational system. This is what we believe happens here as well. Let's talk about why we create, even if we get more exposure, we get a bad sort of exposure to these issues. Because we're saying that there are two issues we have to consider. First, it's a call to action, whether people are likely to act on these movies, and secondly, what sort of historic lessons we learn. In historic lessons, obviously, are not in the comparative, we are much better, because a movie will always portray a very simple picture. Even if it's the best movie in the world, it will still portray a very specific picture, which allows us to learn less from history. But we're saying that when I watch this, I am also not likely to take action. Firstly, because I see this in a commercial, in an entertainment sort of mode. I see this, and then I go and talk to my friends and laugh about the movie and have drinks, and I don't actually keep staying with the suffering. I usually see a good ending or a message of hope. We're saying even the catharsis that this movie is enable is likely to lead people to less action. This is how catharsis works, in the sense that you build these people's expectations, then you release it in a sort of anguish that they see in the end of the movie, and then they feel content. They feel they've already made their contribution, they already know what happened, they are less likely to be more involved in the future. For all these reasons, because we are appropriating these people's voice, because you're not getting the action that we need, and less historical representation, we are proud to propose.
Like, thank you, Prime Minister, for that fine speech, and now welcome the Leader of the Opposition from King's College London.
So the issue here is unclear to me why people having less information is ever a bad thing. The last speaker told us, we can just get it all in schools. I don't think he realised that not everyone does a degree, not everyone continues into higher education, and in certain countries, not everyone is forced to go to school or have the access to it. It is vitally important that these films exist and people are able to do it. What do we stand for opposition? Quite simply, we stand for these films. If anything, we want there to be more films representing more cultures and more diversity. If there's ever insanely bad, obviously we can regret a single film. But the issue is that you can't think of one. We got no example from the last speaker on the basis that these films just never get that bad. I'll tell you why in my speech. Three things. How people receive these issues, why victim subjugation are able to get more discourse and be heard, which is vitally important in order to get change for these people, and why race to the top for equality happens. 4 points of rebuttal. Firstly, it's taught in schools. But note that this isn't mutually exclusive. I can both have them taught in schools and also have films in order for people who don't go to school in order to hear these. Secondly, note that it's also often not enough and people just turn off in schools. Just because you get taught this, you normally get taught about it in a batch thing where you have like 5 different classes every single day and you wind up getting turned off. You don't have a turn off when you've paid money to go and see a film because you're there and you want to be there because you've heard that it's good. Also note, there are normally times where certain cultures there's ongoing oppression against them. Note that LGBT rights are just not taught at school, or at least weren't taught at schools in the United Kingdom, obviously won't be taught in other countries in the developing world, and their voices need to be heard. They need to be able to see films like Girl's Blood in order to be able to hear the subjugation of these people. Then they say that you will have to sympathise with the offending people, because you can never have a film where there are evil people you can't sympathise with. Really? Did you watch Schindler's List? No one watches that and goes, yeah, sure, the Nazis. I mean, I sympathise with them. I mean, that is just madness. Then he says, no, thank you. We don't get a multiplicity. That's a reason to have more films, not a reason to have less films. Presumably, if you don't have multiplicity at the moment, there's less multiplicity on their side of the house because no one's rights are heard. We stand for more films. Then they say it's wrong to make money off these things. I'm fine to make money off the subjugation of people insofar as it helps them to get real change in the world and make sure that their voices are heard. First point, how do people receive it? What do these films realistically look like? They're normally designed to be historically accurate and make sure that they are prevalent to these people. They wanted to frame it up, Hollywood are evil. I mean, there was no real analysis to why this is true, but note that there's normally a massive incentive, and they always do go up to these people and ask their opinions. They make sure they go to leading PhD people, because you don't want to get this shit wrong, because you get slated through the media. And this is the important thing. Even if it's bad, and even if they get things wrong, there is then a colossal backlash backlash that drags us through the media of how badly wrong they get this. It then tells people how they got it wrong, also encourages people to then go and learn the true subjugation of these people. Note that also these films always have protagonists that are from these subjugated societies, and therefore it forces you to sympathise with it, and therefore forces you to see it through the lenses of these oppressed people, something that normally you cannot do, and something you particularly can't do in schools. Now what is the real outcome for these people? People are actually now more aware about these issues. I mean, there are people who just aren't aware about these things. It's factually untrue to say that everyone knows about the subjugation of people in India under the rule of British Empire. It's factually untrue that people are aware about how LGBT movements are affected in different cultures around the world. And even if they're aware of the existence, they not always know of the extent to which it happened to these people, and therefore it's vitally important that you get these. And note that also these films tend to have a prevalent meaning in modern day society. Note that they always wind up having to draw parallels to modern day society. When you watch things like 12 Years a Slave, you wind up drawing parallels and realising how even today we are punishing black people and they are disproportionately harmed by society because they are purposely done in order to try and promote a discourse to get people talking about it. Note that the Ottawa Treaty is known as the Treaty of the People, where they banned landmines because when the people get behind these issues, they wind up drawing parallels and realising how it's vitally important to protect people today. People can get real change, and we need these real change because when people realise a parallel in modern day society, they wind up improving themselves because they become more conscious to how subliminal and microaggressions can wind up harming these people. Secondly, they just wind up getting the support and voting for these issues. And thirdly, they support things like reparations to these people. They support things like positive discrimination, and it's vitally important. Secondly, why is this good for victims of subjugation? But before I move on, I'll take closing.
Okay, so the prioritisation of relatability in these films over actual historical narratives often gets to the point where it isn't someone within those cultures being depicted as the hero. For example, Romeo and Juliet shake hands with the devil. How do you square that with your last point?
I mean, but most of the mainstream received ones are, and as I said, we support more of them so that we get better representation and a multiplicity of them. The second point of why victims of subjugation are important and why they're put outside. Now, the victims want their stories told. Not only the victims from the past, who do have a right in order to have their stories heard and to make sure it never happens again, but note that the biggest insult you can ever deliver to any form of victim is to be ignored. To have people ignorant of your oppression, to have people just unaware it ever happened or the extent to which it is. We think their side has to stand for a world in which there are considerable numbers of people who aren't aware about certain victims and aren't aware of it. Note there is no real comparative for their side. They try to claim it schools, but note that they just don't have the budgets in order to do this. They don't have the large-scale reception for people around the world, regardless of their quality of education. And the subjugation is vitally important to be heard so that you can prevent future subjugation, to get support in order to defend people. Last point, why it creates a race to the top. When one film does well, so you have things like 12 Years a Slave, it encourages other people to realise that there is a monetary incentive of getting it really good and making sure that you really make the prevalent issues that do affect society. It forces people and makes a real incentive for you to constantly make better films as you go along. Even if they get up and go like, there was a few bad ones in the past, because the precedent has been set for amazing films like this, they continually get better because you now have a benchmark that you have to beat in order to make money, in order to be received, and in order to get the widespread appearance. We get better films, we get their issues heard, and we get real change in our world. Their side, victims of silence. We're very happy to oppose.
Let's lead up the opposition for that fine speech, and now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister from Tel Aviv.
Okay.
The factory in which Schindler's List was filmed had belonged to my grandparents. They didn't want their stories told. My grandfather, which is still alive, does not want his story told. Moreover, and more particularly, he doesn't want his story told via the sympathy of Schindler, which was, by the way, open opposition, an SS man in which the crowd is forced to actually sympathize with. When in the ending of La Vita e Bella, the kid shouts, "We have won," guess what? In reality, we haven't. We do not want these stories to be more, and actually to be more encouraged, to be more emphasized over others. I'm going to rebut the claims that were given by this first speaker, then I'm going to tell you what is actually the comparative in this debate. Why, even if Jamie is correct, an art house film have less for budget, we do not care, because the suffering to the victims is something which makes it illegitimate regardless of the discourse which is going to happen in a society. There is no ownership to these stories, to everyone but the members of the group, and then I'm going to tell you why less discourse is going to occur, thus all of the analysis of the advantages are going to be on the other side. Firstly, an intuition about how people receive information, and some information is better than no information. Here is the intuition. In the vast majority of the news cycles that we hear currently in society, we hear things about Muslim terrorists related to what we heard about last incidents in the society. The word Muslim terrorist creates an immediate link which is inaccurate. You have more information because you know that something have happened. However, it connected with the idea of telling you that a certain group is responsible for something which is did it, because it irregardless of the fact that a certain individual is Muslim. Here's the intuition that we're going to use later on to show that sometimes even no information is better than some information in terms of what is more accurate. Then he says, but there is an interest of making historically accurate films. La Vita e Bella is actually filmed in Italy. There were no concentration camps there. The vast majority of the population thinks that they were. This is simply incorrect. Inglourious Bastards, that I'm going to touch upon in a second, is something which is obviously ridiculous and didn't happen in reality. The backlash that they're going to talk about, what backlash? Most citizens are not aware of anything, so no backlash is likely to occur. Again, I was actually asked whether Inglourious Bastards tells an actual story in reality. There is an interest to beautify that. The fact that the vast majority of the people are actually going to be survivors, which means and creates a guilt of the ones that have not. We're going to utilize it upon massively. What is the comparative in this debate? Because note, they come and say that they support more pictures. They cannot do it on side opposition in this debate. They have to defend what is actually happening in reality. When they say that better films are going to be created, yes, better in the sense that they're going to sell more. Not better in the sense that they're going to tell more and accurate of a reality. The fact that we have to compare to testimonies, the fact that we have to compare to education which is happening, and now I'm going to tell you why, even if we do not get enough information, it is best for them. What is actually inherent to these films? They have to sell. Even if the director has the best intentions in the world, they still have pressures from the studios. They still have their next movie in mind in order to get. They still have the complex narrative that must be told. Like a hero encourages a problem and a happy end is going to happen in the end. They must use dramatic effects. They must use music in order to follow the film. They must relax the audience. When they say on their side of the house, but when you teach it inside a history class, you have 5 other classes in the same day, guess what? There is going to be another movie the next day. 5 rom-coms over each of these stories, which means that we just do not think that this is something which is going to be better off. Why does it matter? Firstly, the victims themselves. The vast majority of the Holocaust victims after La Vita e Bella, even if this is not correct, have felt that a comedy of their stories were told. Because it's just easy, right? The hero of Roberto Benigni to just flow through everything that is happening there. His child is going to survive in the end. There was a protest, there was a backlash. However, the film is a top 250 IMDb movie, even though some backlash have occurred specifically on that. They do not feel comfortable. But even if this is not the case, the fact that you're constantly going to pump up in cases of the swastika, or in cases of the Khmer Rouge, the symbols are going to reoccur in the society. They're going to be re-reminded every bit and every time that the story have occurred. Note, we do not perceive in every other field that it is okay to take people and their stories who were victimized in the past and force them to relive what they have done in order to go through it again, even if it is something which makes the society better. Case in point, victims of sexual harassment. We do not think that this is something that you should go through again if this is something that you do not wish to. We do not know why, by the comparative, if you have gone through subjugation or offenses against your own humanity and you are dehumanized as a group, if someone else wants to do it, if someone else wants it in every corner of every street, a swastika is going to reappear again, why do they have the right? Moreover, not someone even from your own group, someone who is going to take your story and tell it as it is not yours, someone who is going to show a happy ending. But you know what? For 41 members of 43 in my own family, they didn't survive in the end. You're going to feel that a mockery is made it out of you that if you're not survived, you do not fit, that others were better for me. Yes, Jamie?
Can you name a single popular film that was solely funded by minorities?
I do not know if this is correct, but moreover, even if it is not the case, we say that we prefer not to have them at all because they do not have the right on principle. Let's talk about why, even if we get more information, it's not going to be good information. Even if more films are going to occur, the films that are likely to occur after the first bridge have been made are films that are just likely to sell more. How do we know it? Because this is what has happened in reality. The fact that films like La Vita Bella have encouraged films like Inglourious Basterds, because now they just sell more. Now this is something which is normalized. Now this is something that you can talk about in an easier discourse. Now this is something that you can utilize because people have moved on. Because the last film have shown you that via the happy ending, you can just progress. Because this is another culture. This is another time. You can just continue. So the better films that they're talking about are just likely to be films which are even more relaxed over time, which shows that they're not going to be even less accurate in moreover. But moreover, these are things, and specifically don't talk about Slumdog Millionaire, just show you something that cannot happen in your own society. Right? These are people that do not have your own skill panel. These are people that even if they are going to use the facts as people that are singing and dancing and having fun throughout all this subjugation, right? Because they can just win $1 million and pull themselves out of what is happening there. You can just not relate. This is Nazi Germany a long, long time ago, and everything have been resolved in the end because the American heroes have come and saved us eventually. These are things which are necessary in order to promote the film. But why does it matter? Because note, and by the comparative, if what we want is to give money, awareness is going to occur, testimonies are going to occur, education is going to occur. You can still show even via the internet some images. But why does it even matter more? Because you're only going to tell the sexy stories. So even if this is the case, by comparative, you're going to use, like the story of charities, you're going to have a lot of more money invested in order to get people interested in the first place. Now if you have a testimony, you're just less interesting to what is happening in the movie. Which means that compared to other atrocities that have happened in the past, if you do not have a movie representing you, your story will not be heard at all. Testimonies are going to be less powerful, which means that by comparative to other atrocities as well, you're not likely to get more stories told, that by and large, you're going to less of an informed society. Because of all of these reasons, we said it is not a right for them to take and capture to that, and this is you're going to get a less aware of a society. We beg you to close.
Deputy Leader of the Opposition from Free Thought.
Members of the House, we are concerned not only with the victims of the past, but also with the victims of tomorrow. We are concerned with creating public change in a way that ensures that the past atrocities that have been visited upon people do not happen in future. And it's on our side of the House that we get this sort of change, that we keep these sorts of atrocities alive in the public consciousness, and that is why I'm very happy to oppose. I'm going to look at 3 things in this speech. First, film. Second, the film industry. And third, victims. And on our side, we're going to show you that on all 3 counts, we are better for this House. First, film. The claim we advance in opposition is very simple. We think film is uniquely capable of activating the moral sentiments of individuals and encouraging them to feel empathy for the victims of past atrocities, and therefore become more likely to act in favor of preventing these atrocities today and in redressing past wrongs. Why is film unique in this respect? Because film is a uniquely immersive audio and visual medium. It's very different from looking at facts in a history book, right? It closes the distance in space and time that people feel with things which happened years before they were born, things which happened in a different country, which they can never see, which they can never feel. What we do with film is that we create suffering that is immediate to individuals, and we allow them to see and experience this firsthand in a narrative form. This uniquely creates pressure and empathy within individuals to then act in ways that redress these sorts of problems. What's the comparative we're offered on the draft? First, they say we'll teach this stuff in class, right? And we'll have memorials. Okay, so memorials are probably ineffective because they don't convey the emotional nuance and suffering of individuals which have been victims of these crimes, right? It's often just like a marble block, no thank you. But if you want to talk about teaching, there are a couple of problems with this. First, history textbooks tend to be an impersonal list of facts, right? And the attitude of a student who's studying history is like, let's memorize a bunch of facts, not really caring about being emotionally involved. But second, sometimes it's not taught. like the fact that Japan happily whitewashes the history of its atrocities that happened in Nanjing, I suggest there are some places where these things are just not communicated to future generations because often there are structural incentives for people who have committed to subjugation to not allow it to be heard. The response is, then the movie won't be made, right, if they don't want this stuff to be heard. Yeah, it'll be made elsewhere, and then people in other countries can watch it, right? No, thank you. People in Japan can still watch movies created in China about past atrocities. So their comparative is faulty in these couple of respects. But the second complaint we hear from Gov is that the problem structurally with film is that it creates a happy ending, right? Like the ending in Life is Beautiful. That was so happy. Spoiler alert, father dies, he's brutally shot, and everyone, like anyone, any reasonable human being watching this film feels a horrible sense of anger at the fact that this person was a victim. No, thank you. But more importantly, even if in some cases movies create a sense of hope, that's important because that hope is what inspires people to think that there is something they could meaningfully do as individuals to prevent this from happening again. Bailey tells you the consequences of this is an uprising in public support for these causes. Things which translate to tangible outcomes on our side of the house. Things like ensuring reparations get paid. That there is public support for these things even after wars have occurred. This means, well, thank you, we have concrete benefits on our side. We don't think we get that on top. The second benefit we tell you, the second unique characteristic of film, which Bailey talks about, is how film is thematic. So film, unlike just a list of historical facts, is very intentionally designed to create parallels between what we see in the past and what we see today. So many films carry the idea that past historical injustice still exists and is present in today's society, and you as a human being ought to be conscious of this and act in ways that reduce it. We haven't had a response to this unique characteristic of film. But third, let's discuss the narrative structure of film. No, thank you. Because the complaint on Gov is that, well, there are heroes on both sides, right? Okay, so first, I point out that in the majority of cases, sympathy is asymmetric. Like normally, there is just like a bit more sympathy, overwhelmingly for people who are the victims. But even in cases when we have a nuanced portrayal of individuals, such as we show heroes on both sides, sometimes it's true. Sometimes in war, there were in fact heroes on both sides. Sometimes it's bad for us to homogeneously assert that everyone on the other side was evil and everyone was uniformly a bad person. So we don't think it's a bad thing necessarily for us to create the impression that there are in fact heroes on both sides. So for these reasons, we think film is uniquely capable of inspiring individuals to act out in real ways, far better than the comparative they give us on Gov. No, thank you. Second, let's look at the film industry. First, I point out that our side does not have the burden of defending every film, right? We can regret some particularly egregious examples of films that were bad. We can happily regret Inglourious Bastards. I'm proud to stand by that. No, thank you. But second, we've told you there are structural incentives for the film industry to produce good films that are nuanced and accurate. A couple of reasons for this, or three reasons actually. Number one, because of the intentions of filmmakers. Like, not every filmmaker is just a money-grubbing, like a fat cat who wants just more money, right? I'll take you in a moment. Why would film creators risk the PR backlash of having an insensitive portrayal that wasn't the point of the movie? Often the only filmmakers who create these films are those who have a vision, an artistic vision of conveying the lived experiences of individuals. This means the victims they talk about are often involved in the creative process and do get their voices heard. Closing.
Okay, so you guys say that people don't know about these atrocities and they're not told about them. Might that make it easier for films to lie to people about these atrocities?
Yeah, I'm currently explaining why they don't, but again, the point is, even if people knew about these atrocities, they might not feel like they have to do anything about them. So moving on, again, the structural incentives to produce good films. The second incentive is backlash. They dismiss this point by claiming that backlash, no one ever hears what is backlash, right? But this is factually untrue, especially in the modern day, when the backlash is very public and very visible. When the backlash happens with thank you on places like Twitter and Facebook, when everyone is talking about how the specific films were inaccurate in their portrayals of individuals, people do see this. And this does affect the credibility of filmmakers. But thirdly, and this is very important, they neglect a structural factor in the film industry, which is the existence and the role of film critics. Critics do play a huge role, not only in ensuring the success of that one film, no thank you, but ensuring that that director's career continues to persist past that film. This means when critics lambast and destroy films for being historically accurate, and that's often the first thing they pick on, I suggest that directors have a structural incentive to ensure that films are good. But there is a second main characteristic of the film industry, aside from the inherent incentive to produce good films. Bailey gives you this point, we don't hear a response. That's the structural incentive to produce good films in the future. The race to the top Bailey talks about, no thank you. Because when the first film that's created creates a nuance, when the first film is celebrated for being a nuanced and accurate portrayal, it sets the bar for every future film that comes out to match this standard of goodness. So in the long run, there are structural incentives in films that are competing in a free market of film to produce better film because that's what gets them to be more popular, and that's what gets them more profit, if we really assume that profit matters. But finally, the unique characteristic of film is that numbers matter, and the film industry does have a great deal of capital to produce these films, much better than private filmmakers do. Bailey gives you an argument about why public pressure matters. We tell you, it's a lie that public pressure has no effect on on political policy when it comes to war. Look at like the treaty against the use of landmines, which is probably known as the People's Treaty, because it was created by a massive groundswell of public support. Hundreds and thousands of people signing signatures on a document against the use of landmines. Numbers matter in influencing public policy, and having more people engaged in the fight against injustice is just therefore a good thing. Because the film industry has a unique ability to do this, that's good. Finally, on victims. So, we point out that if we can show that we protect future victims more, we think that's like unfortunately a lot more important, because unfortunately, past victims not only are they often small in number, but we do think that protecting a large number of people going into the future might be more important. And it's for these reasons that we think we are unfortunately happy to prioritize victims of the future. Members of the House, if we allow the sins of humanity to be silenced and forgotten, then the blood of those victims will be on our hands. I beg this House to wash those hands.
Thank our speaker, indeed everyone on the top half of what's been a very good debate so far, and now we begin the second half. Member of Government from TCD.
Thank you for the floor. I'm going to talk about the incentive structures surrounding popular films and why those prevent accurate historical narratives, but moreover empowering historical narratives from happening. That's the main extension. 2 points within that: Hollywood's corporate and monetary incentives, and then the incentives of sort of the consumer and the reason these films need to cater to a huge audience and the reason that's problematic. First of all, a couple of things that stand out. Darian talks about the backlash that faces these films when they're inaccurate. Two things to contend here. First of all, we contend that always happens. It may have happened with the Stonewall movie. It did not happen with movies that, for example, depicted the Rwanda genocide or many conflicts that happened in the developing world. A couple of reasons for this, right? Like, his assumption there is that, like, so enough people care about this that the backlash is meaningful, when in fact, and that enough people know about this that the backlash is effective, when a lot of the time, in fact, they don't know because of what he said about the fact that these conflicts aren't always accurately taught. That means a lot of people are still being lied to. But B, that the people who actually matter in contending that this depiction of their suffering have the power to do that. Like, there is quite a powerful online LGBTQ community who were able to say that the Stonewall movie did not depict their history accurately. Not so for a lot of the people who have literally had genocides committed against them, right? Secondly, though, on backlash, these communities shouldn't have to do this, right? Like, these movies, saying these movies shouldn't exist in the first place, and then having the response to that be, but there's a backlash, which means they don't do well. Like, maybe they just shouldn't exist. Why? Because for example, the backlash against the Stonewall movie resulted in a petition online on care.org or whatever, and petitioning that the trans movement should be excluded from the LGBT movement because they were being exclusionary towards cis white gay men. And we think that a lot of the time when that backlash comes from these communities, there is a reverse backlash on them. They shouldn't have to do this in the first place, but moreover, it also leads to more suffering on their part when they're seen as sort of rubbishing everyone's good time at the cinema or whatever. Hollywood incentives, right? Darian and Bailey want more films. You can't just say, we support a good thing and then win this debate. You actually have to acknowledge the structural reasons why you think there might be more films in the status quo, which there aren't because it's the status quo. But you also have to acknowledge the structural reasons why having more films won't create the multiplicity of narratives that you want. Why is this? Because audiences want to hear different stories and they get bored with hearing stories about the same thing over and over again. So it's let's do a subjugation of one culture and then we'll move on to the next one once we've told that story in one way and one way only. Even the examples that they can point to where there are multiple films about the same narrative lead to the kinds of more creative ways of telling that story, i.e. the really, really ridiculous ones, like Django Unchained and The Hateful Eight, that depict sort of Civil War era racism. So we think that is problematic as well. But we also think that Hollywood incentives massively play into this. Why? Because first of all, they have to please investors. They have to please the kinds of people that have incentives to keep essentially structures that oppress women, oppress people of color, and things like that in place. We also think that a lot of the time these investors want a kind of movie that can please as many people as possible, which won't necessarily be the movie that questions historical narratives the most, right? We would put an example of this is the fact that Hollywood has not let a single trans actor play a trans person in one of their movies. The reason is that they want to use the most famous and popular actors for all of those movies, which means they'll never accurately depict people's stories if they can choose to do something which is popular instead. We also just think, no thanks, we also just think that Hollywood is a racist and transphobic and homophobic institution, so we think that that's another reason why it's unlikely to depict these stories accurately. They have to stand over the overall climate of these movies. They can't just pick bad examples and say, well, that was bad, we don't understand that. We think that if these aren't taught, like Darian said, then surely lying will actually make that worse. But we also think that even if Hollywood wasn't necessarily a terrible institution, we think that demand creates these problems anyway. Before I go on, I'll take Jamie.
Would you ever allow Hollywood to depict homophobia, sexism, or racism?
As in, first of all, this is a regrets debate where it's not about allowing Hollywood to do anything, but we think ideally if Hollywood were going to do that, they wouldn't do it in a way that is in itself homophobic. But we think that when you're talking about the subjugation of cultures, we think it exacerbates all the problems that I was just talking about, so thanks for that, right? You're at the film because you want to be there, as something Darian said in his speech. We say exactly 4 reasons this is problematic. Four things that people want in films that make this problematic. First of all, they want a happy ending. The kind of hope that Darian talks about is really, really problematic to have, for example, in a film about the Rwanda genocide, where there is still massive ethnic tension in that country, and we should not think that that problem has been solved. Secondly, you want a relatable hero. You want a hero who maybe looks like you and talks like you and thinks like you. They act like what they do is just pick someone from that culture and make them relatable. Oftentimes, no. There is a movie called Behind Enemy Lines, which stars Owen Wilson as an American hero during the Balkan genocide, who is the person who manages to single-handedly put that genocide into the public eye and essentially saves loads of Serbians from certain death. Because of the structural fact that people want a relatable hero, and most people who can afford to do things like go to the cinema will be young and white and middle class, we think that most of the time it's likely to be something like this. We see this also with Shake Hands with the Devil. They also don't want to feel guilty about their own potential role in these films, and they want an easily digestible narrative. And you need to sell this to huge amounts of people. What are the impacts of this? We think you crowd out other films and act like there's an objective truth on this narrative. But we also think that it makes it harder to question yourself. So for example, when you see Benedict Cumberbatch as a villain in 12 Years a Slave and you see him as inherently evil, you think, well, I obviously don't do that. My friends obviously don't do that. The idea that racism is a thing of the past is easier for you to think. But also the idea that you understand the LGBT movement because you've seen Stonewall and you think you know their history. We think at least, even if less people would see films about these things, we think less people seeing more accurate ones would probably be better in terms of making allies. You also think we give the systemically bad organisation of Hollywood money, which we think is problematic, but more importantly, we think it makes it difficult to question certain narratives. So for example, the idea of the US being the world's police force. These guys say it's easier to grant reparations when more people care about these issues. The point is that these films will never depict the US as a bad actor that should pay reparations, or mainstream actors that have lots of money and power and whose consumers don't want to feel guilty about these conflicts. They will never be forced to do good things because of these films. It will only be depicted as individual evil people in history who oppressed a culture, but don't worry, they're dead now. That's all very simple and we can all have hope and a fun trip to the cinema. That is problematic. That is why we propose.
Now welcome a member of opposition from Octos there. speech and now welcome the government whip from TCD. Yeah.
What opening up explicitly say and what closing up effectively claim also is that more information about bad things that has happened is always good. Like, this clearly is not the case when people having that information delivered to them in an incredibly skewed way and in a way that takes the hand, like takes control of those narratives from the people that are actually oppressed by them. That is obviously very harmful. Two broad areas in this summary. First, I want to talk about the structural incentives of big Hollywood studios, so as they will always create like terrible narratives that lead to all the harms both Gov teams want to talk about, and then secondly I want to talk about the way in which consumers interact with these films and the impacts of that. A few responses before that though. So firstly, on this stuff that Jamie says about art house films, right? Like possibly that would have been true about say 20 years ago, right? But it is just true that the cultural climate nowadays is significantly more diffused than it ever was, and through things like social media, more and more people are actually coming into contact with different and diverse kinds of films. So for example, the film Happy Birthday Marcia, about the person who actually threw the first brick at Stonewall, is an example of that kind of film that came to prominence. Those are the kind of films we're okay with on our side. Secondly, Jamie says you'll have this weird whitewashing effect where if you make films like in the past about America in the past, suddenly you'll have to have people of colour being absolutely equal in them. No, I mean we don't think if we regret Hollywood inaccurately portraying subjugated people in this way, or portraying subjugated cultures, we would still regret a situation where they're still portraying them and they're not subjugated at all. That would still be something we would stand for on our side. But then thirdly, recognize there is no engagement whatsoever with Dee when she tells you that, even when you watch those kinds of films, you interpret that as something that is terrible that happened in the past, right? That you are not like those people, so you're less able to challenge your own internalized racism or whatever. That's also true, by the way, of films in the developing world. It makes it look like that's something that exists over there and not here. No, thank you. And next on the issue of the milk example, right? What we would say is that that was part of a generalized social trend that was bringing those issues to the fore anyway, right? We would say it is very plausible that all this stuff that's happened over LGBT issues in the last few years, no thank you, has led to a situation where that kind of information is becoming more prevalent anyway. Structural incentives to misrepresent and create bad narratives. Recognise that first up, and to a certain extent closing up as well, spend most of their case just describing what they think the status quo of these films are, right? Not really giving any structural reasons why it would be the case that we would get good films, right? The one kind of effort we get comes from Darren, right? When he says, look, market incentives mean that the incentive is always to create better films, right? But recognise that what people think is better doesn't necessarily mean an accurate representation of what this thing was, right? People might think a lot of people probably think, say, Django Unchained is a very good film, but that doesn't mean it is in any way an accurate portrayal. No, thank you. So it's unclear why those market incentives work in the way they say they do. The next thing they say is there's a backlash, right? But again, recognise Dee's analysis, which gets no response, regarding Stonewall, where you essentially had forced these people to deal with a situation where trans people were petitioned to be excluded from the movement. But also recognise though, right, that if Stonewall had been released about 5 years ago, that backlash probably wouldn't have happened, right? Because the trans lobby was nowhere near as powerful as it is now. What does Dee bring you on this that is specifically important as to reasons why why it's structurally these studios will create bad narratives? The first thing is essentially demand, right? To using Darren's own analysis on it, the people want to see people want to see films that portray themselves in a good light. People don't want to be told that they are bad people and that their culture are bad people. That people want to see simplified versions of stories, right? So and Hollywood studios know that, so they want to provide those kinds of things. They want to provide challenging things. But then secondly, also things like corporate funding, putting huge amounts of pressure on films never to portray structures that might benefit that might benefit those corporate sponsors. No, thank you. But like enforce the kind of racist things that we think are bad, right? So that's an important thing. But then thirdly, it's also just true that Hollywood generally tends to be quite a racist and sexist institution in itself anyway. So the kind of things it tends to portray, and that leads to stuff like never having trans actors, like Dee says, right? So the comparative here, it's important to note, is like possibly, although we've contested that, you have less people knowing about these things, right? But there are structural reasons why the information that they are gaining from watching these films is essentially bad and leads to them pursuing bad policy outcomes and leads to bad things generally. Sure, Jamie.
Given you want no betrayal, do you stand for a world in which mainstream movies do not show African Americans in pre-1960s America?
Okay, so we regret the general climate whereby movie studios produce the kind of films that they produce now. Like we would rather there be no depiction than there be an inaccurate depiction, and we think there are structural reasons why the depiction is inaccurate. As we've given it to you. So how do consumers interact with these films then? So the first thing to note here is it essentially crowds out they crowd out other kinds of depictions. It presents that particular idea as objective truth essentially, and that leads to a situation where it becomes much more difficult to challenge that historical narrative in any sense, which is hugely problematic. But more broadly though, and as Dee tells you, like when you watch a film about racism in the past, when you watch a film about awful things going on in the developing world, like the way in which that film is presented to you is that there is this objectively evil villain who is doing a bad thing, not that there are systematic social structures that led to him doing that bad thing, not that those same systematic social structures could lead to you thinking that you are capable of doing similar bad things, right? That leads to a situation where you're unlikely ever to ever think you are capable of that, and when you're more likely to think that racism is an issue that is now solved, and so you're less likely to challenge your own racist preconceptions. And finally, as Dee tells you, it leads to a situation where the dominant thing being portrayed are things like the US being the world's policemen. That means that idea becomes in the political arena much more difficult to challenge when everybody has internalized it through seeing US soldiers being heroes and going and saving the world. More information isn't always a good thing, especially when it is bad information. Propose.
Now welcome the opposition whip from Oxford.
Much as I as a historian regret it, the way people get their conceptions of their past and therefore of the way their country is at the moment is primarily through popular culture such as films, not through going down and sitting down and reading a history book. Closing opposition tell us they would rather that black people in the far South America weren't portrayed at all, that they were portrayed in a way which is imperfect. This is the crucial point in this debate. No depiction is an inaccurate depiction, because you are being fundamentally excluded from your nation's entire history. Because African Americans are told before 1970 they didn't exist or play any role in the American story. They watch films about the Old South where the question who is picking the cotton, who is being exploited to create this wealth is never even answered. Fundamentally, if they want no depiction of inequality or no depiction of suffering and evil, that means people get that is whitewashed from history, and people don't get the impression of what really happened and what the reality was. Okay, two key points of summary. Firstly, about whitewashing, no thanks, history, and why we think that has such an appalling effect on the way people perceive the present. Secondly, about rights movements and the need to bring people in through successful films. So before that, a characterization of the kind of films we are going to see. Ultimately, when you're making a film, you put an enormous amount of thought into what the storyline is going to be and how you're going to portray things. especially if you know it's going to be a very, very sensitive issue. This may not have been the case so much in the past, when we saw a world which was less attuned to the need to be sensitively discuss these issues, but increasingly this is the case, and you will know that you will face enormous commercial problems where people don't want to come and see your film unless you make sure you are being sensitive. Increasingly also in a world where markets which are non-Western are more and more important for films' commercial viability. What that means is that films which discuss oppression are becoming increasingly nuanced how they discuss it. A film like Selma would not have been made 20 years ago, but certainly would be made today because of the changes of those commercial structures which Proposition wants to talk about. Ultimately, those new films to create new historical narratives and to replace the more oppressive and less sensitive cultural narratives which Proposition tell us was created to some extent in the past. You also have to bear in mind their alternative. Their alternative is the state, through its education mechanisms or through funding of films. They tell us that Hollywood is transphobic. Sadly, they are right, but that's not the question. The question is the Texan Education Board, which is providing the alternative mechanism for education on their side of the house, more transphobic? The answer in almost every case is going to be yes. They also want to tell us about art house films. The reality is that art house films have less money and less ability to get their message out to people because they're not watched. But moreover, no thanks, really sensitive art house films which discuss things in enormous nuance can follow somewhat less nuanced commercial films. Why? Because it creates a discussion and it creates an interest within both the movie industry and the audience, which means they get discussed. That's why you get extremely good films on minority rights like 38 Grape Street, following commercial films like Selma or Lincoln, because it creates an interest in that and creates a market for it. So firstly, in terms of the whitewashing of huge segments of history and huge segments of reality out, you can't get films like Slumdog Millionaire which discuss poverty made, because that's explicitly what Proposition tell us. People still make films about the past because the past is interesting to us because we're fundamentally interested in how we got where we are, and because it represents an important part of our identity and also an important commercial and cultural trope. People aren't going to stop making films about America before 1990. People aren't going to stop making films about the Second World War. What they do have to stop making, if they're not discussing oppression or structural harms, is films which discuss exactly what happened and discuss how people were subjugated. You portray an old South where everyone is white, which is explicitly what side Proposition asked for. You portray a Second World War where you focus primarily on combat rather than crimes against humanity and the immense suffering which was caused. What that means is that you are creating films which portray history in a way which is fundamentally inaccurate. They say, I'll take opening just a minute, we would rather there was no information than an accurate information. When you're still making those films, no information is the most inaccurate information you could possibly present. They want to talk about people being marginalised within their own story. What could be more marginalising than watching a film about the period in which your own life was set and seeing no recognition of your own suffering? Opening.
I think the entirety of Op-Bench relies upon the assumption that people are getting to get more aware and act upon this information. We have given you several reasons why it is not the case already in our case. Inaccurate information, catharsis specifically in case of atrocities and not just history events. A lot of different movies that are going to crowd out testimonies, the education, and the important movies. The fact that it's a simple narrative by inheritance, specifically in commercial movies. Please engage.
Okay, so they've essentially given us in their case two reasons they don't think it has effects. Firstly, because they're commercial. Bear in mind, people can still enjoy a film and take a serious political message from it and often do so. Secondly, they told us it crowds out other testimonies. Look, the markets for really serious books about historical atrocities and the markets for popular films portraying them are not in direct competition. No one says, should I go and read a book about the appalling abomination of historical slavery, or should I go and watch a film about it? They are considering watching a film at the point where they're going to do so. So the question isn't, do they spend their time watching witness testimonies, but the question is, do they spend their time watching a rom-com instead? They give us structural problems on their side of the house. To some extent these exist. There are structural problems with the need to be relatable. Bear in mind, the worst thing for someone who's been affected by something is that no one knows, that they know they've been whitewashed from history and they have to keep re-explaining the reality of their own suffering. That is the most triggering thing, the most appalling thing for them. It is very sad that someone feels, that someone is reminded of what's happened to them when they see imagery being used which refers to that. It's much less bad when they feel that no one cares, that they feel that their very existence and what's happened to them is irrelevant, then that they're occasionally exposed to that but could broadly be able to avoid it. In terms of villains being sympathetic, as they told us, it's important people realise that it's not about good and bad, but rather about structures which are fundamentally evil. And it's only when villains are in some way sympathetic that people can question their own prejudice. So secondly, in terms of the effects on rights movements, to which we have no response whatsoever, the reality is we've seen a splintering of rights movements, whereby some individuals have become in positions of more power, and they're less likely to be aware about people with the same identity of them who are still being fundamentally structurally oppressed. It's not true, as proposition assert, that they're informed well in every case, because they're living different lives. One of the crucial ways they can get informed is by watching films which tell them about the history of their identity and how people have fought so they can have the rights they have now. Something they never engaged when we definitively proved from closing opposition. Very, very proud to oppose.